Well, good morning, folks. Welcome to our first ever hybrid program here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Today, we're of course live here in the Grandstand Theater. It's the first public program we've been able to do in the Grandstand in quite a long time. So it's nice to be back in this wonderful theater. We're also doing the program virtually on Facebook Live. This is the first time we've done both of these things simultaneously. So it's kind of an exciting day. And it's made more exciting by the program that we have coming up. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the education department here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. I've been doing the virtual field trips and virtual programs ever since the pandemic began about a year and a half ago. Very glad to be with you again today. Very glad to introduce our special guest as part of the Hall of Fame's author series. His name is Joe Posnanski. Joe is the author of a number of books, not all about baseball, but certainly some about baseball, including a terrific book about Buck O'Neil. He has written for such publications as The Athletic, Sports Illustrated, NBC Sports. Also, he wrote our script for our film, Generations of the Game, which you might see later today. We have fans of Generations of the Game.
As we should, of course.
Yeah, very good. And he is the author of this new book, which is about as thick as some of those old encyclopedias I had back in the 1970s, the Baseball 100, where Joe writes very thoughtful, lengthy essays about the 100 best players, in his opinion, in the history of the game. So please join me in welcoming to the Hall of Fame's Grandstand Theater and to Facebook Live, Joe Posnanski. Joe, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Also want to mention later today, we will be doing a book signing just outside of our museum shop. And then at 1:30 this afternoon, Joe and his co-host Michael Schur are going to be broadcasting the very popular Poscast. Again, that'll be starting at 1:30, and that'll take place right here in the Grandstand Theater as well. Joe, while the rankings of the players are always going to be the hot topic with this book, you really, from what I've been able to gather, wanted this to be a lot more. You wanted this to be in-depth essays on a group of great players, in some ways, kind of a loving letter about baseball.
Yeah, you couldn't have nailed it any better, Bruce. Thank you, by the way, for having me here. This is incredible to be in Cooperstown, especially this time of year. Yeah, so I'll give you a very brief history of how this thing came about. About a decade ago, some people might remember, I was doing my blog, and at the time I was working at I think Sports Illustrated, and I was doing my blog, and I loved doing lists, and I came up with this formula that I liked, where I was going to count down the 100 greatest players ever, and I was going to do it on a daily basis. I was just going to have this thing updated. And at that time, the whole idea was just the list. I just thought this will be fun. People will argue. It'll be fight. You know, it'll be a lot of fun. And I really liked my formula, and I thought this is going to be great. And at that time, what I was going to do was write just a few sentences on each player. You know, just sort of some sort of very quick explanation of why they were there, or a recap, or something like that. And I very quickly found out that just because of my ridiculous personality, I couldn't do it. I could not do that kind of list. So I started, I had number 100, and then number 100 was a couple thousand words long. And I'm like, well, I can't do that again. And then 99 was like, oh, let's make that one even longer. And they just kind of kept getting bigger and bigger. And it literally got to the point where I could not do it anymore. It was eating me out of home. And I didn't know, so I stopped in the middle. I just stopped at number 30, which made people very angry. You know, what you find is when you say you're going to do 100 greatest and you stop at 30, there are a lot of people that aren't going to like that. But I couldn't do it anymore. I just literally couldn't do it. And I said, I'll bring it back in some other form, because I just don't have the time. I don't have the strength to do this. And I did try it again. And again, I stopped in the middle. Again, it was just too big. And then finally, what led to this book was I realized that the list is, for me, secondary. Of course it's important, and as you might imagine, over the last, since the book came out, I have had a lot of arguments with a lot of people about the rankings. But what you said is right. I mean, for me, this book it's 870 pages of why I love baseball, and it's told through these 100 greatest players, and the rankings are there to be argued about and enjoyed, but it's really the essays and the stories behind these players that I had somebody say to me recently, one of just many very kind things that they said, but somebody said, I used to love baseball, and I got this book. My wife got me this book, but I haven't liked baseball in years. I've just lost touch with the game. And this book brought me back. And to me, like, that wasn't, you never believe that anything like that's really going to happen, but that was the dream, was that this book was going to be something that people could read and sort of fall in love with baseball again.
Joe, let's talk about the players who were eligible to be considered. Obviously, major leaguers, Negro leaguers. Were any other leagues considered, like the Japanese leagues, the Mexican leagues, any other leagues outside of major leagues, Negro leagues?
Yes, every league was considered. And I did try to do a lot of research where I tried to find the best players in the Mexican League, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, before they could come to the major leagues. And there is a Japanese player in this book. So yes, the other leagues, there was a Cuban player, a couple of Cuban players that were very close to making the list, which I'm not going to remember. But I think for me, the idea, that was like a big part of this book for me. This book started with the stats like the first one did. I went to my friend Tom Tango, who is the guy that invented wins above replacement.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom and I worked on a formula where we put together sort of the things that we thought matter most when it comes to judging players. So not just sort of the core stats or even the advanced stats, but also peak versus career, having a high peak. We wanted to weight the game so that in different eras you had different weights and that kind of thing, and so on. And then I came up with a list, and there was a list. We had 1,000 or more than 1,000 players on the list that gave us an order, and then that was where the starting point was. But then nothing mattered more to me than putting in those players that were not on the list, those players from the Negro Leagues, and those players from Japan. That to me is what made this book what I hope it is.
Yeah. When you talk about the statistical criteria that you and Tom Tango used, was that purely statistical for the ranking, or was it 85% and then you left some percentage open for your own interpretation?
Well, the original list was purely statistical, so it's just a pure ranking of the players. And then that list does not, I mean, it resembles what's the list in the book, but it's not close to the list in the book. Yeah. So I started with that, and then it's like, okay, now throw those out the window. I have this list, and now it's like, okay, so now where do these players belong? Who actually is in the list? The hardest part for me was the last 10 players. There were, I think, I've said this, that there were 40 players that were in contention for those last 10 spots. Mm-hmm. So it's funny because lots of people will say to me like, oh, well, Eddie Murray should be on this list, or Barry Larkin should be on this list, or Shoeless Joe Jackson should be on this list. I'm like, they were all 101, right? They were all super duper close, and that's how it went. But yeah, then it was really about feeling and the story of the players, and I've said it that I think that the rankings were more art than science, and I think that's probably the best way to say it. I mean, we definitely started with a very, very hardcore scientific list, and then it built into what it ended up becoming.
We mentioned Mexican League, Japanese leagues. Maybe the greatest player in Mexican League history, Hector Espino. Did he make the book?
He did not make the book, but he was in the final 40 to make it. I mean, it was just super close. But of course, that's the hardest part, is every player, the real true number 101, the person who literally was 101 was Turkey Stearns. He was a great Negro Leagues player. Was called Turkey because of the way he ran. He used to talk to his bats, which is always fun. And he was this great home run hitter and great outfielder and for the Negro Leagues in Detroit. And but I wish he was in this book. But if he was in this book, somebody else would be out. And that's where it really gets hard. It's my wife. I write about this at the end. My wife, endured this with me. This was 18 hours a day, just thinking nothing but baseball, just constantly, writing, researching, finishing. It was a constant battle. And at the end, she said, I just don't understand why this couldn't have been the baseball 50. Like, that just really would have been so much better. But for me, it should have been the baseball 250, because there was just so many players that I wish I could have gotten in.
Yeah. Follow up on Japanese leagues. Did Sadako make the book?
I believe you will find Sadako in this book, and which is one of my favorite chapters. I knew something about him, but was not aware of just the. To me, if a player is sort of like an early kind of flaky ne'er-do-well, and then he finds sort of a guru who teaches him how to hit using a samurai sword, that guy's got to make the book. I think that's pretty much has to be in there. So what an incredible story.
We should mention with players like Hector Espino, Sadako. Hector Espino almost certainly would have played in the major leagues if he wanted to. He rejected. He did not want to leave Mexico. He was afraid of some of the racism that he'd heard about here in the States. So he had many offers. Cardinals, Mets were among the teams, but he did not want to leave Mexico. So he essentially stayed there. And Sadako, even if he had wanted to come here, could not. The rules did not permit. There was no free agency system. There was no system that we've seen now in place since Hideo Nomo entered Major League Baseball back in 1995. Now, you've mentioned some of the great players. Turkey Stearns would have been 101, Barry Larkin, Eddie Murray. Who are some of the other great players that you couldn't include? And then at the end, you were like surprised. How could I not get him in there?
Well, there's like 30 of them.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Pudge Rodriguez is a guy I've heard a lot about, and I would have loved to get into there. Joey Votto is a guy that I really wanted to get on the list, and not just because Joey Votto has yelled at me for not putting him on the list. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Zach Greinke is the guy I've probably written about more than anybody else, and he just barely missed this list. It's a long list, and there are players that are, sort of legendary at this point beyond, not beyond their playing ability, because they were obviously great players, but they've become legends, and so somebody could honestly, if they're a baseball fan, say, how in the world could Juan Marichal not be in this list? How in the world could Lou Brock not be in this list? And they're right. It's really hard, to, when you get down to, there have been more than 100 legendary players in baseball history, right?
I think it'd be especially difficult with current day players because, well, A, their careers are still going.
Right.
B, we don't really have much of a chance to sit back and gain any perspective. That will come with time. But I know there's at least one current day player in the book. Mike Trout's in there.
Yeah, there's several. There are 8 or 9 current day players. Most of them are like Albert Pujols at the end of their careers. But it's very interesting. And so this was part of what Tom and I were trying to do with our stat thing. If there's one thing that separates baseball, there are many things that separate baseball from other sports, but in football, when you look at ranking the football greatest players, nobody seriously puts Sammy Baugh at number 1 on the list. Nobody. Don Hudson, he'll make some top, 10s or whatever. Nobody thinks Don Hudson was the greatest player ever. You go back to the old players from the, before the 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s. Most people don't even know who Duke Slater is or any of these guys, right? Basketball, same thing. And obviously basketball's newer, but basketball, nobody's going back to Ted Strong in the 1940s or whatever to pick out a a Harlem Globetrotter is the greatest player ever. But in baseball, that's what everybody does.
Yeah.
I mean, there's literally, you will never see a list that will not have Babe Ruth and Honus Wagner and Ty Cobb and Jimmy Fox and Cy Young and Walter Johnson and Pete Alexander. And you'll never see a list that doesn't have those guys very, very high. And those are players that played 100 years ago. So in some ways, baseball has the opposite of recency bias, I think. Football, it's very recency bias, right? Like Tom Brady's the greatest player of all time. And if you say anything else, people will scream at you. But if you say Mike Trout is the greatest player of all time, people will lose their minds. Like it's not possible for a current player to be the greatest player of all time. So we have to work on that. So when you talk about trying to find current players, my fear were there weren't going to be enough, and I'm not sure there are enough. I'm not sure that Joey Votto and Zach Greinke shouldn't be on this list, but that was the way it came out. But there are, Max Scherzer's on this list, and Clayton Kershaw's on this list, and Miguel Cabrera's on this list, and Albert Pujols is on this list, and obviously Mike Trout is quite high on this list. And there's another part of me, I don't know if there'll ever be a Baseball 100 Volume 2 or whatever, but I mean, I'm already excited because I think Juan Soto is going to be on this list someday. I think that if you can stay healthy, a guy like Fernando Tatis or Shohei Ohtani. I mean, I get asked a lot about Shohei Ohtani, even though it's only been 1 year, but it's one extraordinary year. The way he's captured the imagination. So yeah, I really feel like in a lot of ways we don't appreciate the time that we're in baseball. It's too easy baseball to sort of go into history.
Many of these old time players you mentioned, there's nobody in this room that saw any of them in person, but because of statistics, because of the lore of the game, what's been said, the game has changed, but it hasn't maybe changed as radically as football. So we do feel comfortable in voting for these players for the Hall of Fame or voting them for the rankings that you're doing. I'm curious, of the 100 players in the book, I'm not expecting a specific number, but roughly about how many of them do you think you were able to see in person?
Right.
You were old enough to see play.
Right. So I actually did something like this. I actually looked. So I've talked or connected with 70 of these players, 65 of these players, but that is not the same thing because that includes time I've spent with Willie Mays or I never saw Willie Mays play. I saw Henry Aaron on television when he was breaking the home run record, but I never saw him play. Al Kaline and Juan Marichal. I mean, my baseball sort of consciousness begins in the mid 70s. So I didn't see probably 60% of these players, even on television. And then when you talk about seeing them live and in person and all that, that's probably 30 or 35. I mean, it's probably not more than that. I mean, I would say if somebody said, did you get to see Pete Rose and Joe Morgan and Johnny Bench and Mike Schmidt and Dale Murphy? I did. I saw those guys because I followed them very closely when I was younger. But I saw Murphy in person, but I didn't see the others in person because I just wasn't. I've been writing baseball for about 30 years, and that's. That goes back to the late 80s and the early 90s, and that's it. That's how far back I go. So yeah, most of this was definitely building off of stories, reputations, research, and what people said about these players.
For me, the first season that I consciously remember was 1972. I think a little bit older than you. What's the first season that you consciously remember?
I consciously remember collecting 1976 baseball cards. That's my conscious memory. I have this super vague memory of my first baseball game was in 74. And I only know that because Gaylord Perry was pitching for Cleveland, and I was living in Cleveland at the time. And I have no memory of that. I have a vague memory of Don Hood picking off a runner, but I've gone back to retro sheet and he never did. So I don't think that's true.
You dreamt it.
I dreamt the Don Hood picking off a runner. So, but I have like vague memories of like the yellow Oakland A's jerseys in the World Series
Sure.
in the daytime. Like that's, I don't have any memory beyond that, but I just remember like the television being on and those uniforms being bright yellow and all of that. But even 76, I was 9. I was a fan, but I mean, I wasn't, the players were still baseball cards to me at that point. I mean, I would say I became a sort of really passionate fan probably, when I was 11 or 12. I think is when it started happening.
Still, though, 1976, that's a pretty good starting point. You got to see Mark Fidrich. That was a national phenomenon.
And I remember that.
Yeah. Big Red Machine. That was the second of their 2 consecutive championships. That was a fantastic team. So the bicentennial year, that's a pretty good year to start being a baseball fan.
Yeah, no, it was a good year. And, in 77, right, going right into that Bronx Zoo thing that I remember, pretty vividly, the Yankees thing. I mean, I thought about this as I was writing this book a lot. Like one of my most vivid memories of that time was, it all came through television, of course, but there was this in the World Series when the Dodgers were playing the Yankees. Whoever, I guess was Roone Arledge was running ABC at the time, whoever's doing ABC and directing, they did this brilliant sort of thing with Bob Welch and Reggie Jackson. Bob Welch was this young fireballer then, and Reggie, of course, was already Mr. I don't know if he was called Mr. October yet or not. Maybe he was. I think it was 78, so I think it was after he hit the 3 home runs. And just the battle, between the young and the old. And I remember it just being like a movie, like really having like this script value. And then Bob Welch struck him out, and it was like this big. And then the next day or whatever the next time was, they were facing each other again, and it was like this. It really did have like you can almost hear like the cowboy music in the background. Just did this great duel, and Reggie hit the home run off of him, and I don't know. Everything felt like Titanic then to me.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the players that did make the book, the Baseball 100. Let's start at number 100. Pretty interesting selection, Ichiro Suzuki.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. So I wrote this book live. I mean, it's the book is a little bit different than the live version, but I wrote this book for The Athletic live. So I kicked it off with number 100 of Ichiro Suzuki. And here's the thing: when you give somebody the book and say, "Okay, Ichiro's number 100," you might have a reaction, you might not, but you have the whole book, so everybody else that's in it. You can look and see and how. But when you just put out number 100, all anybody can think of is what an insult that is to Ichiro. There cannot possibly be 99 players that are better than Ichiro. And of course, you can't be like, well, there are probably more great players than you're remembering. It doesn't matter. Like it's that really developed it. So I will admit I wanted to kick off the book with a favorite player and somebody who I loved, and the rankings are as people will see, and I'm sure we'll talk about. When I say more art than science, I do mean that there are players are connected to numbers more than they are ranked in many cases, as we'll see. And to me, like number 100 had to be like the essence of this project. It had to be, and I love Ichiro as does everybody, and he was a great player. And it's one of those things that I think when I first started, it was harder for people to understand what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you see number 100, you're just like, oh, this is the ranking. And you think you're going to read an essay explaining why he's number 100. And you're going to talk about, well, he was a great hitter, but he didn't walk and he didn't hit with a lot of power. And so that's why he ranks a little lower. And it's none of that. None of those essays explain the rankings at all, because that's not the point to me. So the story is about Ichiro. It's about Ichiro and how awesome he is, and how how much I love him, and so that's it takes a little while, I think, for people to get, I think, what you're trying to do.
And you did factor in what he did in the Japanese leagues, right?
I did.
Yeah.
Well, oh yeah. I mean, look, that is 100% true. I mean, you can, from a purely statistical standpoint of what he did in the major leagues, you could leave him out. He was not in the top 100 on the formula that we did. He was. I mean, just not that it matters, but I mean, just he was not in the top 100. But he, of course, was for me. And yes, I mean, I think, well, what I say, talk about in the book quite a bit is talking about the hit record. And of course, he has the world hit record, but, you know, he doesn't have the major league hit record. And my argument, and I think this is pretty much backed by what he did, those 7 years in the Japanese league, if he had come to the major leagues, he would have been just as great.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
there's just no question. And I think if he had
Maybe better because he was younger.
and more games, I mean,
Yeah.
like, you know, when you look at the hit totals and all of that, he was younger. I mean, he would have been certainly just as great as he was in the major leagues, but I think he would have been just as great as he was in Japan. And I think if he had started in the major leagues, he would have broken Pete Rose's record. I really believe that.
I think you're right. Let's talk about Sadako a little bit more. I never got to see him play. I don't even know if there's much tape of him on video, but I've heard so many people who did see him play and have looked at his numbers and the quality of play in the Japanese leagues and say, this guy, if he'd played in the major leagues, he would have been probably a perennial home run champion, or at least a contender for the home run crown.
Yeah, I mean, and there are lots of quotes from people saying that in the book. I mean, there are lots of people who faced him in Japan who talk at length about how great he was, and not only a great home run hitter, but a great hitter, right? I mean, a 300 hitter, 320 hitter, and walked and did everything that you could do. And it's really interesting to me, and I in some ways it's very, very different. But in some ways, there's a way to think about the Negro Leagues and Japan in this way. Obviously, they're completely different in so many social justice ways. But it wasn't until Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella and Don Newcomb and Minnie Minoso and the very earliest players became stars that you could start thinking, how great would those players have been that were in the Negro Leagues at that time? You know, there were, you know, Satchel Paige was famous and all that, and Josh Gibson had some things, but generally the feeling was these guys can't play in the major leagues. I mean, that was just the feeling across the world. And I think it was somewhat similar with Japan until Ichiro. You know, I mean, for pitcher for Hideo Nomo, but for when Ichiro came and basically was every bit as good in the major leagues, if not better, than he was in Japan, it was like, oh, you know what? It doesn't, I'm not saying the league's quality is the same. That's not the issue. The best players in those leagues could be the best players in this league. And I think that allows you to look at Sadako in a completely different way.
A lot of major leaguers who went over to Japan and flopped, partly for cultural reasons, but maybe also because they underestimated the competition. They couldn't adjust to the workout.
It's a different, it's a whole different environment out there.
So Sadako is 85. Interesting. A guy I loved. Sadly, we lost him not that long ago. Number 83, Phil Niekro. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people, they've said, well, you know, he used that trick pitch, the knuckleball. That doesn't really count. And I've never understood that argument. What he did was legal. He mastered a pitch that few others have mastered. I'm glad to see he made it. 83.
Yeah, and was underrated in my view, just completely an underrated player for that reason.
Yeah,
and you've heard him talk about it, and as have I. I mean, I think it bothered him a little bit that people did not always take him seriously. They just kind of saw him as like a sleight of hand artist or something, where he and it wasn't the case. I mean, it wasn't just him throwing the same knuckleball again and again and again. I mean, the guy understood batters. He understood how to disrupt timing. And the thing I've never understood about people, because the knuckleball feels like, oh, if I practiced that enough, I'd be really good at it. You know, like that, like it has this sort of reputation of being something that it's like us mere mortals, if we just worked on it, we could throw it. And it's much harder to throw a great knuckleball than it is to throw a 99-mile-an-hour fastball. Many, many, many more people have thrown 99-mile-an-hour fastball than have been able to control the knuckleball.
Right.
And so I've always thought that, you know, that Phil Niekro is completely underrated. And what a life, you know, Phil Niekro lived. I mean, when you just start hearing the stories, Phil Niekro, like the first catcher that he ever had for the knuckleball was a guy who lived across the street who was named John Havlicek, who's only one of the greatest basketball players ever. And in his senior year of high school, in a championship game, he gave up 1 run, and it was a home run to Bill Mazeroski. Like,
Yeah.
so like he's like everywhere. He's like Forrest Gump. It's like everything,
Yeah.
wherever he goes, like that's where baseball history is.
You get a chance to interview him at any point?
I did
Yeah.
here in Cooperstown. I mean, I interviewed him more than once, but here in Cooperstown for the movie that I hope you all will see.
Yeah.
I interviewed him, and he was incredible, just
Yeah.
incredible. And you know, the great thing about the movie that I hope you appreciate is, for every minute of the movie, which is the movie's 16 minutes long, I think. For every minute of the movie, there's 20 minutes of unbelievable stuff we couldn't get in.
Yeah.
It's just the entire interview with Phil Negro talking about his father and the coal mines and learning the pitch from his dad, and of course his brother was a great pitcher as well, Knuckleballer Joe Negro. Every bit of it was just wonderful.
Yeah, one of the great guys, one of the real gentlemen. We really miss him. He was a great ambassador for baseball in the Hall of Fame. Another interesting selection, number 70, Sandy Koufax. Sometimes people minimize his career because it was relatively short because of the arthritic elbow, but such a dominant pitcher that you put him number 70 in the book.
Yeah, and and there are plenty of people that think that's way, way, way too low, or way, way, way too high. And by the way, when people say that's too high, I don't know what they mean. Like, I assume they mean if it's too high, that means that they think that they should have a lower number. Like,
Yeah.
I'm confused by
Right.
the low high
Yeah.
thing. So that's not going to work.
Yeah. The lower number is better.
The
Yeah.
thing I love about Koufax is, in some ways, there are 2 things about Koufax that strike me. One is, when you rank players, you look at their career numbers, and their career numbers do not include the postseason. So you separate the postseason out, and then you have to figure out how much weight to put to the postseason.
Mhm.
But it's like with Derek Jeter, everybody has exactly what Derek Jeter's hit total is, and his hit total do not count the 200 hits he had in the postseason.
Yeah.
And it's like, weren't those more important than the other? Like how can you not count those?
Sure.
And I don't know what you do with Sandy Koufax when you have the greatest postseason pitcher, one of the greatest postseason pitchers ever. Like, how much does that move him up, right? Or how much do you count that? The other thing with Koufax is, there are a lot of people in recent times, and I've fallen trapped to this as well, who will look at really, really, really great pitchers like Johan Santana
Mhm.
or Pedro Martinez, and say, okay, well, you know what? Their peak was as good as Koufax's. And you can show numbers that show that to be true. I mean, Pedro's peak, I think, is the greatest peak ever. But he threw 335 innings a year. So, like, one season is 2 seasons for Johan Santana.
Yeah.
I mean, so yes, it's only 4 years, but it's, whatever, 1,300, 1,400 innings, if you count 62 as well. And I think that gets overlooked too. It's like, for somebody who is that great over 200 innings, that's great. But this guy did it for much, much longer.
Yeah. Let's do a couple just random. I'm just going to pick somebody out of Cal Ripken Jr. There's a good one. What comes immediately to mind when you think of Ripken, other than the streak and the durability?
I actually, it's really interesting you say that, because I mean, I of course write about the streak because you can't avoid it, but that's not the first thing that comes to mind with him. It is the thing that he became, right? He became the streak, and it just took over everything. And I think it makes you forget how great he was. He was an unbelievable shortstop, just an absolutely spectacular defensive shortstop. And he played defensive shortstop at the time when nobody that big had ever been a shortstop. I mean, it was like nobody thought he could actually be shortstop. And yet, through sheer, I mean, he wasn't fast. He didn't, his range was instinct and preparation and all of this. He is the guy who got the most out of who he was, I think, of anybody. I mean, he certainly had talent. He was, was a very big guy and all of that. but he loved the game so much, he just took it to a whole other level.
He comes in number 44 on the list, so he's in the top 50. Randomly, I just went to number 29, old-time ball player. We haven't talked about many of the old-time players. Pretty good second baseman, Eddie Collins.
Yeah, Eddie Collins. Eddie Collins is like a big figure, right? He's like not only a great player, he's a big figure. A lot of people might just know him from being on the 1919 Black Sox and being sort of the goody two shoes of that group, and as portrayed in the movie Eight Men Out, everybody hated him, and he was like this because he was holier than thou, and I write a little bit about him. It wasn't entirely holier than thou, and he was in that circumstance, but just did everything well. I mean, and like truly was sort of the paragon of what a player was at that time. I mean, smart, fast, great defensive player, hit with power, doubles power more, but was just sort of the paragon of what baseball was at that time.
You mentioned that he wasn't that well liked. His nickname was Cocky.
Yeah.
Because of his arrogance. Yeah. I bet he loved that, right?
I probably did.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the top players that you featured. And I actually want to talk a little bit about each of the players that made your top 5. And before I reveal who they are, some of you may already have seen the book and know, but we have one player from the Negro Leagues, and then we have another player, 2 players that actually split their careers between the Negro Leagues and the Major Leagues. And then we have 2 players that played entirely in the majors. Now, coming in at number 5 is a great Negro Leagues player. And if I had not seen the book, I would have guessed Josh Gibson, phenomenal catcher. But you went with a player even a little further back, maybe not as well known, underappreciated, Oscar Charleston.
Yeah. Oscar Charleston, to me, like casual baseball fans in general know Satchel Paige, and they know Josh Gibson, and they probably know Cool Papa Bell. But that might be where it ends. I mean, those are probably the 3 most famous players. And I imagine that there are plenty of people that are going to pick up this book who have never heard of Oscar Charleston. And which is really remarkable, because I'm certainly not the first to say it. Most people at the time when he was playing, and in the years after when he was playing, would tell you that Oscar Charleston was the greatest player to play in the Negro Leagues. My friend Buck O'Neill, who I wrote my first book about, used to say that Willie Mays was the greatest player he ever saw in the Major Leagues, but Oscar Charleston was the greatest player he ever saw. He used to have this whole thing: could hit you 50 home runs, steal 100 bases, win Gold Glove in center field. He was just this extraordinary combination of power and speed. At different times in his career, was called the Black Babe Ruth, and also called the Black Ty Cobb. It's sort of some blend of those two players. And so I said before that I did not talk about the rankings in these essays, and I didn't. These essays are specifically about the player, but because this one is going to jolt people, I think I did talk about the rankings in the Oscar Charleston set, and I said, and I believe this to be true, that the Oscar Charleston being at number 5 is a challenge. It's a challenge to you to sort of stretch your mind and see just how great you think these Negro Leagues players were. It's like, Satchel Paige was great. Satchel Paige pitched in the major leagues too. He came later. Josh Gibson is great because of the legends and all of that. And he also played right up to that time when Jackie Robinson played. But here's a guy that was in the 20s, and also 30s. A guy long before there was ever even a thought of having an African American in the major leagues, and he was this force, and so that's why for me it was I was so happy to put him at number 5.
When you see photographs of him, he was really an unusual looking athlete. He had an incredibly thick waist.
Yes,
he looked heavy. I imagine he got even heavier as he got older. And yet he was a tremendous athlete, speed, power, great center fielder. You know, I almost think of he was sort of like built like Hack Wilson, but even larger.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a big guy. You know, it's not a fair comparison because he's much smaller, like in height and all that. But there was like when Mike Trout came up, there was like this wonder, like, does he have a good enough baseball body, right? Like that was one of the questions about him. He was a little stocky and like this. How is that going to really play out? And obviously it's been okay. And I think Oscar Charleston was that way. I mean, he was just this, you know, this incredible athlete. And it is interesting to me. I mean, when you look at baseball history, there are some guys who have like sort of bad body guys like Kirby Puckett, who were just incredible athletes.
Yeah.
You could be, you know, you could be a great player, but to be such an incredible athlete like that is always interesting.
Number 4, very familiar name, played briefly for the Indianapolis Clowns and then a long time for the Milwaukee and Atlanta Braves, Henry Aaron.
Yeah, I don't know what's left to say about Henry Aaron.
Yeah. You met him, right?
I met him numerous times.
Yeah.
I did several events with him and just a, you know, I mean, we can talk about the player that he was. And obviously to me, he has the total bases record he has will never be broken. And I don't think it'll ever be broken. And so you can talk about what a great player he was, but he was so much better a person. I mean, he was this force for good. I write a lot about the home run chase in here because it was such a difficult, trying time in his life. But I will tell you this. So I wrote the Henry Aaron essay. It ran, a version of it ran, and we were eating dinner, and phone rings, and it's a Milwaukee number, and I was eating with my wife, my daughters, and I said, "Oh, it's a Milwaukee number. It's probably a talk radio or something." And they're like, "I know." My wife's like, "No, answer it." And so I answer it, and it was Commissioner Bud Selig, former commissioner of baseball.
Yeah.
And he proceeded, and I don't know. I mean, I've obviously talked to him, but I don't know Bud Selig. But he had found my number, and he wanted to call to tell me how much he loved the Henry Aaron essay. And he was very close to Henry Aaron, and he wanted to tell me how much it meant to him. He could not have been nicer. He was incredibly kind. He talked about this is the best thing I've ever read about him, which I just was really moved. I was really touched by it. And we went, this was 25 minutes of him just praising me. And then he said, "Okay, so I see he's number 4 on the list. I know 2 of the people who are in front of him. Who is number 3?" And I told him who number 3 was. He didn't have another nice word to say for me after that. So that's how that goes.
Well, that's a perfect transition to
There you go.
number 3, BB, Barry Bonds.
Yeah.
Of course, not in the Hall of Fame for reasons likely not having to do directly with his playing days. Obviously, different kind of a personality. He was often not a well-liked player. I think he's maybe trying to make some amends for that.
Yeah.
Coming up, I believe it's his final season on the final year on the Hall of Fame ballot that's coming up as well. But there's no denying that this man was a remarkable player. We've never seen anybody from age 32 to 38 play the way he did.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, I fully get people who want to say that, you know, so much of it was not authentic, right? Like he bulked up and it was unnatural and this, that, and the other. But here's what I would say about Barry Bonds. First of all, by the numbers on our list, he was number 1. I can tell you that. He was number 1 by the numbers on our list. But here's what I would tell you about him. Until 1998, Barry Bonds was not appreciated, even though he won 3 MVPs and everybody knew he was the best player in baseball and had been for a decade. And I don't know that people saw that, right? Because there were more charismatic players like Ken Griffey that we all wanted to be the best player. And Ken Griffey was, you know, there were many things that Ken Griffey did even better than Barry Bonds. But when you look at the entire package, the defense, the speed on the bases, the base stealing, the hitting and the power, and particularly the walks, which is, I think, the one thing that separates him from so many others is on base percentage. I mean, he was the best player in baseball and was on an arc to be one of the greatest players in baseball history. I don't think there's any question in my mind about that. I mean, he was already on that arc, and he was, in my view, a qualified Hall of Famer by 1998, regardless of what happened afterward. Then he bulked up. We all know that story. He wasn't the only one. The game was still coming to grips with how to deal with things. There was no testing. There was no anything. And Barry Bonds got so good that he literally broke the game. The game literally could not handle how good he became. And you know that because in 2004, he was intentionally walked 120 times in a season. I mean, there are Hall of Famers that have not walked 120 times in a season. Many of them, most of them have not walked. He was intentionally walked. They literally gave up. They literally went, there's nothing we can do to get this guy out at any point. If there's anybody on base, we are walking him. Anybody. And sometimes if there's nobody on base, we're walking him. Sometimes if the base is loaded, we're walking him. I mean, he had literally gotten so good, there was no dealing with him. And I don't think you can ignore that, you know? I mean, I just don't think you can ignore that. And look, I have my own opinions. I'm sure everybody here has their own opinions about whether or not he should be in the Hall of Fame. And that's a very interesting and controversial argument that goes back and forth, contentious. But when you're ranking the greatest players of all time, to ignore Barry Bonds is to ignore baseball history, in my view.
I'm curious, are you a voting member of the Baseball Writers?
I am a voting member.
How long have you had the ability to vote?
I have been voting for almost 20 years now.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have voted for Barry Bonds every year, in case you're wondering.
Yes. All right. Interesting.
Yes.
I wasn't going to ask you that, but
I know.
You volunteered.
I volunteer it.
Yeah. Number 2, very familiar name. And I guess some people will say that they'll be surprised that he's not number 1. But I can certainly understand when we hear the identity of number 1. But let's talk about George Herman Babe Ruth at number 2.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'd say the most, people have had lots and lots and lots of arguments with this book, as they should. Maybe that's the biggest argument that I've had, is that people think Babe Ruth should be number 1. And the argument for Babe Ruth as number 1 is incredibly compelling and strong. I mean, obviously, he dominated his era like nobody else. I mean, he hit more home runs than entire teams.
Yeah.
And then has has that trump card of being a great pitcher before he was a great hitter. Nobody else has that. So Shohei, I guess. And all of those things are very viable, and he absolutely could have been number 1. I mean, there's no bigger figure in the history of baseball. There's no more dominant player in the history of baseball than Babe Ruth, and that's why he's number 2. I'm pretty high up on the list.
Obviously, a phenomenal hitter, phenomenal pitcher with the Red Sox. I guess the one thing I don't know, how good was he as a defensive player, as an outfielder?
My sense is, from doing the research, is that he was not a particularly interested outfielder in general. That he
was passing the time between.
He was passing the time. I don't know if it was quite to the Ted Williams level, where but was he wanted to hit, and that was sort of he obviously had a great arm, but there are surprisingly few stories that I could find of that arm in the outfield. There were players that like Trispeaker and others who really were renowned for their arms, and Babe Ruth was not, at least in print. So probably not a great outfielder. And then, he was fast when he was young, but as years went on, he became significantly less effective on the bases, and of course made one of the great base running blunders ever, ending the World Series. He was a great hitter. I mean, that was, that's what he was.
Yeah. We can certainly argue about greatest player. I don't think there's any argument. He is the most famous player internationally. He's known in countries where they don't even play baseball.
Yeah, I think he's the most famous athlete in American sports. I think. Yeah, I think more books have been written about him, and there have been more. I think he's definitely the most famous.
Yeah. All right, that leaves us with number 1 on the list. I'm sure some of you may be guessing as to who it is. He was a great center fielder, started in the Negro Leagues with the Birmingham Black Barons, played most of his career with the New York and San Francisco Giants, a little bit toward the end with the New York Mets. And he's our oldest living Hall of Famer. Say hey kid, Willie Mays.
Willie Mays, yeah. For me, again, when we put together this list, it was I really wanted well-rounded players. That was important to me. And there are players in this list that are not particularly. I mean, they did one thing so exceptionally well that it was bigger than anything else. But I wanted this to have I wanted well-rounded players. And to me, there's never been a player more well-rounded, obviously, than Willie Mays.
Yeah.
And I think there's just a little extra thing. So this is, number one, the Baseball 100. And when I look at Willie Mays, and I write about this in the essay, to me, Willie Mays is baseball. It's like he was the greatest center fielder with the greatest arm, greatest, great base runner, great hitter, great power hitter. But also he did everything with this joy that came through every single thing he did. The hat flying off and the stickball in the streets and everything else that was Willie Mays. And that makes him number one for me. That to me, I think of, okay, what is it that I love about baseball? It's like everything I love about baseball is Willie Mays. And that's not to knock anybody else. I've heard people since the book came out, I've already heard from people who have said, well, Henry Aaron did everything that Willie Mays did, except his hat didn't fly off his head, right? Like it was a quieter version of what Willie Mays was. And I think that's true to a large extent. But I also think there's something about the charisma of Willie Mays. There's not to say that Henry Aaron was anything less charismatic, but the joy that he exuded, he was pure poetry, and happy to have him at number one.
Yeah, literally had no weakness as a player. He did everything phenomenally well, and as you mentioned, he had not just the substance, but he had that style, that flair. I saw him a little bit toward the end of his career, and even though he wasn't as fast then as he was in his prime, there was nobody more exciting to watch on the base paths. And I didn't see a lot of him in his peak. I really didn't see him at all in his peak in the mid 60s or the early 60s as a center fielder. But I've heard many people say that they feel he's the best center fielder defensively they've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, certainly seemed to be the consensus was how great he was defensively. And of course, we have some footage of it, and obviously made the greatest catch in World Series history and all of that. But yeah, I mean, I think when you're looking at, okay, what is it that we love about baseball? There's nothing that we love about baseball that Willie Mays didn't do better. I mean, that's to me is puts him at number one.
All right, that's the book. We have peppered Joe with questions, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions as well. So we have Addie Brundage from our education department going around with a microphone. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand, try to get Addie's attention. She'll come over to you with the microphone. And we just ask that before you ask the question, just tell us at least your first name and where you're from. But we do have a few remaining moments with Joe, so we'd like to mix in some questions from anybody here. So who's going to go first? Gentleman here in the second row, your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name's Ed Baranowski. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. I was just curious, so between the first time you went through these rankings on your blog and the book, you've changed things a little bit. Did the formula change? And if not, when you do get around to another version and you start including the Juan Sotos and Fernando Tatises, what would it be like to actually have to drop Ichiro, or do you just increase the number? Baseball 125, baseball 150.
There you go. Yeah. Or just make it some sort of random number like 137 or something like that. This is all the players I want to include. I don't want to include anybody else. Yes, the formula did change significantly from when I first started. And sort of my perspective on the game changed, I guess, a little bit. I mean, that's hopefully if you're changing the formula, you're doing it to sort of, get a better feel for what you value in baseball, I think, a little bit more. And I definitely wanted to value well-roundedness more, like just as an example. I also wanted to focus more on peak. I wanted players who to me were at their very best, were incredible, rather than players that were very, very good for a longer period of time. So some of that stuff I did adjust in the formula. And you're right, I went back and looked at the 70, I guess, that I did. And there are some players on that list that I do not have on this list, and that I wrote full essays on. And you know, it's not that those players got any worse, you know. I mean, it's not like Harmon Killebrew changed anything, you know. It's just that the new formula sort of weighted things that I have not weighted as well before, in my view. And if I ever did another version of this, my wife would, first of all, leave me, but secondly, yeah, I think I would be different. I'd want it to be something that again reflects. Hopefully, I'm learning as we go, and so hopefully something that would reflect how I view the game.
Here's a possible solution for a new book: 20-way tie for number 100.
There you go.
So that way you can keep expanding.
You know what's funny is in the version, my first version, I had ties. So it was like the baseball 100, but it was like 106 players or something. Like I wanted to do that with this, but it's cheating.
Yeah.
So, there is one tie in this book, by the way. Just so here you go. Here's a little insider stuff on this book. There is a tie. There's a tie at number 20 between Frank Robinson and Mike Schmidt, who both wore number 20 in their lives. And there's no 19. There's no 19 in the book. And by the way, there's also no table of contents in the book, because if you want to find out where everybody is, you got to work. So there's no 19, and the reason there's no 19 is for the 1919 Black Sox. So it is my homage to Shoeless Joe, who is not in the book, but there is no 19.
Very creative.
There you
I
go.
believe we had somebody here in the third row.
Yep.
Your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name's Mark. I'm from Ballston Spa, New York.
Hi, Mark.
I wanted to ask about sort of a similar question in a way. The transfer, I followed the series on The Athletic and enjoyed that. And in making that into a book, how does that process work in terms of, do you kind of throw everything out and start over? Do you put extra stuff in that you left out the first time? Is there a lot of rewriting involved?
There was a lot of rewriting involved, and much more, in fact, than I thought there was going to be. Because I thought we were just going to kind of run the series as a book, and it's not like you pick up this book and it wouldn't feel that much different than that one. But I was surprised by how much, by doing it daily, there was sort of daily stuff in there, stuff that made sense on that day, but wouldn't necessarily make sense now or 2 years from now or whatever. So there was a lot of that. And then there were quite a few adds to things. Like there were things that I thought, well, wait a minute, I thought I included this story or this thing. So each essay is somewhat rewritten. I don't know that it would feel that much different. You know, I mean, I think you'd almost have to, have them side by side in some ways. But yeah, but on the work end, each of these essays was rewritten, and it took quite a long time.
Anyone else with a question for Joe Posnanski? I believe we have a Kansas City Athletics fan there. There we go. Hi, your name and where you're from.
I'm Neil, and I'm from Westchester. I was just curious, Joe, was there any major league teams that did not have a player included in the 100 that you were surprised by?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, so Tampa Bay has Boggs. I'm literally trying to think like some of the more recent teams.
Arizona, Randy Johnson. Maybe?
Randy Johnson and Kurt Schilling. They're both
Okay.
on. They're both on this list. Florida. I don't think there's a Florida player. on
Cabrera.
there. Oh, that's right. Miguel
Yeah,
Cabrera.
Miguel
I didn't
Cabrera.
think about that. Yeah, so
Yeah.
he's on there. Washington might not have anybody on there. Might not be
Not the
anybody.
Senators, but the Nationals.
The Nationals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There might not be any Nationals on here. None come to mind. Virtually every team that has had a history has some people on here. And I actually went through it and went sort of team by team by team. And it's interesting, like there is one sort of lifelong Kansas City Royal on here, just as an example. This George Brett. But there are 13 players with Kansas City connections on the list. Some of them with the Monarchs, some of them with the Athletics. When Reggie Jackson started with the Kansas City Athletics. So like there are super connections throughout that I think connect to virtually every place. I think in baseball. Good question.
Did I miss anybody? All right, we'll take one last question. Person in the red sweatshirt.
Hi, I'm Dave. I live in nearby Oneonta.
Dave.
I just wanted to ask Joe if you had a favorite essay out of the 100.
It's a really good question, and I think the correct answer is no. Right? Like they're all 100 are equally as good. But I do actually have a favorite essay, and it's my favorite essay because it's the essay when I wrote it sort of gave me a full picture of what this book is, in my view. And that is the Carlton Fisk essay. I wrote about Carlton Fisk, and when I first started researching, okay, well, what am I going to write? Because it was really important to me that each essay be something hopefully completely different than it's been written before, best I can. And I'm like, everybody with Fisk, everybody's written about the home run in the 75 World Series, and he was this great longtime catcher with the Red Sox and White Sox, and was a great older player. And then I started really finding some stuff about his father and his connection to his dad. And their fathers and sons are a big part of this book, I will say. And I started researching the essay and writing it at the same time. And to see Carlton Fisk and trying to sort of impress his dad, and his dad being this very stoic New Englander who was very difficult to impress, and you seeing that go through his life. There's a wonderful story when he was a very young player. Carlton was a very young player. His dad came to the Red Sox clubhouse and was walking around, and I think it was Carl Yastrzemski who said, "Oh, you must be Carlton Fisk's dad." And he said, "No, Carlton Fisk is my son." and it sort of was the essence of their relationship. But then you come all the way forward, and he has this great career, and he ends up here in the Hall of Fame, and he's at the Hall of Fame speech, and he's you could see him building up to the very end. At the very end, he's gonna talk directly to his dad, and he's thanking everybody. And then he comes to the part of his dad, and he's tearing up, and it's very emotional for him. And then he says, "Dad, I hope that you'll understand this, that all my life I've been Carlton Fisk. I've been your son, but today you're my dad." and I just thought that's perfect. That is everything I love about baseball, everything that I feel about the depth of this game. And that's when I knew what this book was. And I don't know that I fully understood it until then, that this book was, of course, the rankings, of course, the arguments, of course, all the other stuff, but it is really about the stories that I think make us love the game.
The book is The Baseball 100 by Joe Posnanski. It's terrific. It's gotten great reviews, and it is available for purchase in our gift shop down on the first floor of the museum. In fact, we're going to be heading over to the museum. We're going to take Joe over there, and he'll be available to sign copies of the book. Some of you may have brought a book with you. You can certainly get that autograph. If not, we encourage you to purchase it. It is terrific. It has gotten excellent reviews, and I think Joe's insights and passion for the game in speaking with us, very evident and reflected in what he wrote in this book. Joe, thanks. This has been great.
Awesome. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. We hope you enjoyed it. And please join us just outside the museum shop if you can. If you want to get a book signed by Joe, ask him some questions. That would certainly be good as well. We'd love to continue the conversation in our lobby. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.